Hello everyone, it's M. Welcome to a surprise Eternal Patch breakdown for a surprise Eternal Patch, March 2nd, 2022. There is a new patch coming out to patch a number of different throne cards, as well as change up some expedition and other cards. It's going to be a pretty big pile of stuff. We also have the draft pack update as well. So a lot of things are changing, and there's going to be a lot of different cards to talk about. We'll go ahead and get right into it. There's a lot of different changes listed. I went over the patch notes in the. I will link the patch notes in the description below, but we're going to go over through this one from this side because basically it's just a little bit easier to do so. Also, there's some construction just eternally outside of my room, which is hopefully not audible, but we'll see how it goes. Might be a little more noise pollution than usual on this one. Regardless, let's go ahead and talk about the different cards and what we got going on. So first things first, Dinosaur Nest is getting nerfed. It is going from a 2-cost that plays 3 different dinosaurs and then immediately plays the Sheltered Valley to something that plays all 3 dinosaurs and then on the 4th turn transforms Dinosaur Nest into the Sheltered Valley instead. So instead of getting a surprise 3/3 card that might end up being a killer, which tends to be a big sweep, or instead of getting a 3/3 charge, which can often be a way to just instantly kill your opponent, or instead of just getting a random 3/3 flyer, you basically just get 3 1/1s, and then later in the turn you'll get the Sheltered Valley, which is still extremely good value, but definitely over a more significant period of time. This, I think, does change up the value of this card quite a bit. It was basically ubiquitous in Expedition. It's an incredibly strong card under that particular aspect. It's just a nasty, nasty card that also happens to give you tons and tons of value because Sheltered Valley gives you a lot of different bonuses, not only to the dinosaurs that you've just played, but also to dinosaurs that you might play in the future. That isn't necessarily something that's going to change. The value engine is still there, but a lot of the value that you might get from basically getting that one surprise dinosaur is gone, as well as just generally slowing the tempo of this card so that people can interact with it better with more aggressive strategies, deal more damage to it, and also, as listed in the patch notes as the primary reason to sort of stick with this, decide whether or not to destroy the Sheltered Valley after seeing the 3rd dinosaur. So if they don't get 3 killers in a row, or if they get just a couple of flying cards and you're kind of okay with taking damage, if they get a 1/1 charge, that's really not going to be a particularly big deal. You might not actually want to throw a ruin or any sort of other relic destruction effect at this card, and I think that's a reasonable change. It definitely does mean that you decrease the power level of Dinosaur Nest quite a bit, which is something that you definitely want to do, but it also opens up just a lot of other ways to sort of play against the card while still not making the card bad. The card is still a value engine, the card is still just time in a nutshell, and the card does a lot of other different things. Alright, these patches are, these particular cards are not in any particular order, so we're going to be going over a lot of different changes. There are draft changes, there are expedition changes, and there are throne changes. I think we'll try to address this from the position of the notes and go through them in that order, so we're going to be hunting around for them a little bit. Second thing that got nerfed, Helena Sky Guide. People who know Helena Sky Guide know this card is pretty disgusting. It used to be a give another unit +3/+4 flying and endurance this turn. Now it's give another unit +1/+1 flying and endurance this turn. The justification given for this is that basically the card just needs to be a little bit more under control and not do quite as much burst damage. Helena Sky Guide is a green card that is typically used to give green reach, which is not necessarily the kind of thing that you really want a green deck to have. It basically just gives them a huge amount of burst damage because they managed to take one of their big creatures, play down a flyer, and then immediately get one of their big creatures to jump across and often kill you in one hit, making the rest of the card's excellent stats and abilities not really matter quite as much. The fact that it is a 3/4 flying endurance for 3, it's already a super efficient card, but that contract just generally ended up ending games in ways that maybe weren't terribly interactive, and also I don't think really jived with how Justice usually plays. The sort of jump kick ability to just blast your opponent is something that Justice can do, but I wouldn't say that it's something that is a particularly healthy pattern for Justice, nor anything that I'm particularly happy to see most of the time. You still get a decent amount of that particular aspect with this card now. This card still guides other cards to the sky, but it's going to deal 2 less damage. That card's actually going to be killable if it gets the burst, because you might be able to actually target it with other like damage abilities and mess with it in that respect. And just overall, it's not quite as much of a worthy contract, and the hope is that Helena's ability will instead be used a little bit more, a little bit less, but like basically like a little bit more conservatively is the word I'm looking for. So yeah, it's a pretty minor change, but well, it's actually a pretty major change for Helena Sky Guide, but it is something that I think should really change up what decks are going to be viable in Eternal Expedition, and should make a bunch of other different changes. Okay, we got some throne nerfs. Siditi the Killing Steel and Zumakin the Surveyor are both getting some hits. Siditi is going from being a 6/6 to a 5/5. I'm always in favor of this card getting nerfed. Curse of Provocation is a obnoxious card, and Siditi is a card that I think tends to sort of dominate Valkyries as an available option. I never really liked it at 6. I have not really liked this card since it came out. I think the Curse of Provocation thing just like doesn't really jive a lot with what is interesting about Justice, but like the ability to sort of like set these things up and just get tons and tons of cards off of your opponent not being able to attack was a pretty big deal. It's a rough time, and like this card being a little bit more killable is certainly one way to sort of take it down a little bit. The objective with both Siditi and Zumakin is listed as basically making sure that other 5-cost units have options, and that also means like opening up throne decks to play decks that aren't really focused on Justice or really focused on time. With these 2 cards seeing some nerfs, I think that should actually change things up a little bit. The other one that we're definitely going to be seeing a bit of is Zumakin the Surveyor, which is going from a 7/7 to a 6/6. This card has Ambush and Warp. It was always like the biggest and most surprising warp, but it's such a value engine that I don't feel that it's actually going to take too much of a nerf from losing a point in stats. This card still kills just about everything that you warp it in on. At this point, the rate of it allows it to maybe trade with a couple of cards that it wouldn't trade with otherwise, and also means that it's not going to pressure quite as hard. Both of those things are perfectly fine for Zumakin. The card's still going to be very viable in the format and should be reasonable even in the decks that we're already playing it. I don't think there's going to be any tweaks to those decks, but they might go down in win rate just a little bit, which might in turn encourage other things to be played. Finally, Wump and Mizo Party Pair. I think this is a nerf that I was definitely looking for. This is a 2-cost 2/2 that previously transformed into a 6/6, which, yeah, that's a little too big for what this card already does. As a 2-cost 2/2 that immediately plays snowballs and tends to lead into situations where you are damaging a bunch of stuff on your opponent's side, and your opponent is just not getting like the same kind of benefits. This card was just incredibly efficient at 2, and a very, very strong reason to be deep into Primal, which, I mean, strong reasons to be deep into Primal are very good, strong reasons to be deep into Yetis are very good, but Party Pair was also just turning into like sort of a big time deck where you get those big 6/6s, and you sort of end up in this kind of like very big smashy territory, which isn't really Yeti style, but also isn't really like as much fun. I think this card just had way too much value on the far end, and considering that it basically like sets itself up so that it can transform into more party pairs after you've played the first one and played a bunch of snowballs, then that is something that like really makes Wump and Mizo something that is well worth nerfing a little bit. At 4/4, this card is just not going to trade as well with a wide variety of other things. The ability to deal with it just by playing out more mid-range and just slightly slower decks than the Yetis is going to be something that I think will have a little bit more of an advantage. So yeah, the 4/4 party pair is definitely something that I think is super welcome. Okay, we have some side grades and buffs or nerfs. Grotoff's Burden is not too much of a side grade. It's definitely a significant nerf. This card went from 5 to 6, but it does give your single faction units +1/+1 in addition to Exalted. So you have to play at 9 to bury the past, which is a really powerful aspect of Grotoff's Burden. I would say at 8, it was often a struggle to get this card to actually like set down and sort of basically do the thing that it's going to do, which is immediately vanish one of your opponent's biggest units and then put you in a position to end the game on value alone. It also is now pay 6 to draw a card, so same sort of deal. You have to pay a little bit more to actually get access to the card, but I think it's that threshold of 9 that's really going to affect whether or not this card is going to see a lot of play. Um, this is designed to take it out of the market options for specifically Crack the Earth, which one of the more upsetting thrown market cards, but also just to make it like a little bit less of a market choice in general. There are a lot of different setups that can just do this type of thing. I believe Lights Out Ace actually made it to Master Rank 1 last month with a Xenon deck running Grota Burden. And yeah, it was a pretty good list. I actually played a little bit of it myself. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, like this kind of thing is definitely like Grota Burden has been around for a long time. It's an extremely fun card. It does a lot of extremely good things. Slowing it down a lot is going to take it a little bit more off of the list of things that are available, but I am a big fan of making sure that certain market cards are not ubiquitous in every single deck, and this is just sort of Time's general strategy for winning games, and it's probably past time that it's seen a little bit of a nerf. So, yeah, not too unreasonable. Okay, what else have we got? Talir, Time Jumper. This one got, I think, a general buff. It's not, like, amazing, but the basic idea is that instead of just a spell being played directly on Talir, it also cares about spells being played on the enemy turn, which causes Talir to immediately jump into the start of the next turn. I've never seen anyone play with this card, but the charge ability on it is really, really fun and interesting, and the thing that usually happens with it is that it dies immediately to Harsh Rule or some sort of other, like, wide sweeper, or the card is just irrelevant for most of the game. This card can still be irrelevant for most of the game, like that's just not a thing that's going to change about it. It is something that can be consistently erased, but I think that the ability to basically have this come out at every turn, be attacking, and then if it gets targeted by anything, just vanish again, is a pretty interesting option and should make it so that the card can actually be killed with a lot of other, like, unusual options. I think it's an interesting one now. A Talir Time Jumper deck definitely sounds like a really fun deck to build, and I think this is exactly the kind of change that you want to set up to actually make that deck a buildable option. Maybe we'll construct a brew and get something going with it. Oh, and we've got Heart of the Vault. Heart of the Vault is going from a 6-cost, a 7-cost 7/7. It was a 6-cost 6/6. It then became a 7-cost 7/7. That was too slow, and the card just didn't see any play. It's going back to a 6-cost, but it's now a 5/5. I'm really fine with this change. I think that the one thing that is nice about Heart of the Vault is that it does have that, like, that evenness of numbers. It's not quite as poetic a card anymore because it's not a 6-cost 6/6 with the deal draw a card reduced by 2. Like just like little flavor touches that make a card really kind of like pop. But that's not really a big deal overall, and I think that in terms of like mechanical design and balance, this is a really good change. It means the Heart of the Vault is going to be much more playable in Praxis, and the idea here is to get Praxis to come back into the meta, which it currently isn't seeing as much play. And also to just make it so this card is a little bit weaker. And I think that when it can't trade with other 6/6s, which is fairly common in big mid-range strategies, I think that's something that actually does like make a huge difference. For example, this card can't block Talir Time Jumper anymore. There are a lot of units at 6/6, and the basic thing with 6/6 to 5/5 changes, it typically doesn't make the card more vulnerable to removal, but it does make it much more vulnerable to bad trades. A lot of cards deal 6 damage or have 6 health. 5/5s don't really trade nearly as profitably in the mid-range, particularly at 6 cost, so this is something that actually does make a pretty significant difference, as well as decreasing the tempo of the card dramatically. Heart of the Vault is still going to be an insanely strong card, don't get me wrong. This is a card where, in Praxis, like, you're just going to see some ridiculous options and get to do a lot of cool things. Like, this is a really fun card to play, and I think that Praxis decks will be playing it pretty consistently, and it might even get, like, somewhat obnoxious, but it is going to be significantly less powerful than the previous option because it is a giant value engine, and it is also a value engine that does a lot of, like, interesting on-summon effects, but it's a little bit less of a value engine if it doesn't trade effectively, and that's something that this particular change really does matter for. So it's a big deal. I think it does put Heart of the Vault back into the meta because 7 was just too slow, especially for a warp card, but taking it down to a 5/5 really makes it so the card probably is just a lot more fair. Okay, so those are the side grades. The next things we have to cover are the Nightfall buffs, because a bunch of Nightfall cards are coming to Expedition with the March 2nd draft pack update. So we're going to be seeing a couple of Nightfall changes, and this is actually going to be Some pretty significant ones. Nocturnal Observer going from a 2/3 to a 2/4. I probably want to talk about this a little bit in context with Baying Sarasaur as well, but basically this is a really significant change for draft in particular. Nocturnal Observer was a really, really strong draft card when the Nightfall set first came out. That was like third set, so it's possible that the higher power level of cards in general might mean this is not quite as good, but this is now a really good blocker that also allows you to do the draw discard option and just doesn't die to a wide variety of interesting removal. I think this is going to be a really, really strong draft card and potentially actually see some play in Expedition for that exact value. It seems like a pretty decent option. Baying Sarasaur, however, this one's really wild. This was the staple card, I think, in time when the Nightfall set came out as a 3-cost 2/2. It just attacked as a 4/4, and that was a really, really big deal at the time. It also triggers Nightfall, which deals a lot of damage, and Xenon sort of rush decks that wanted to really use it were just very, very strong. Now this thing is attacking as a 5/5 because it's starting out at a base 3/3. That means it's a lot less vulnerable to a wide variety of sweeper effects, which is great, and also just does some like pretty exciting stuff with everything else. I think this is now an incredibly strong limited card and potentially a very good expedition card as well for the amount of like just raw aggro this card generates. It's really, really neat. Extinguish has gone from 4 to 3, which is pretty awesome. Nightfall, kill an enemy unit with 4, or kill a unit with 4 strength or less. You actually can kill your own units with it, which is good. This card was always too expensive to really be any good, and at 3, I think it's significantly better. It's still like a reverse Vanquish that's more expensive, but yeah, it triggers Nightfall, and having a bunch of Nightfall cards together to do interesting things with that is a pretty fun time. The last Nightfall card that's getting a buff is Bloodsend Avasor. This card is basically just getting deadly in addition to its normal stats. This was always a pretty efficient flyer with a good ability, but I think that the deadly thing does not change a lot for Expedition. The primary thing it changes is how effective this card is in draft, because it is now a significantly bigger threat in draft for its efficiency. A 3-cost 3/3 flyer is already very good. A 3-cost 3/3 flyer that trades with the 1/5s, the 2/5s, all of the like flying units that can jump up in the air, like Kickflip Monk. There's a lot of different flying units with high health that are the method of dealing with flyers in draft, and this is a card that now like just sort of evades all of them by being deadly and still also being a 3/3. It's pretty strong. I think it's going to be a solid choice for draft, and yeah, these Nightfall cards seem pretty pushed. There's going to be some pretty interesting options. Sarasaur takes my vote as probably the most powerful option, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. All right, aside from Nightfall buffs, we have the non-Nightfall buffs, Torque Ballistics Crafter, going up to only 1 card discarded to play a Rocket Sled. I'm a big fan of Torque Ballistics Crafter. I think this is going to be a pretty powerful change to the card that should actually make it much more viable in Expedition. Here's hoping. It's a fun deck, and spell damage cards are probably always in need of a buff. It's just not an archetype that ever really seems to see as much play as a lot of the other things. But Torque is very efficient. The snowballs that it gives you are really, really good. The Rocket Sled is amazing. And like, yeah, this is like going to get you a Rocket Sled off of just the snowball that you're discarding to play Torque, which is a straight permanent +1 bonus to Yetis and a straight permanent +1 bonus to your spell damage. Really, really good stuff. Not having to discard your entire hand is a significant upgrade. So we'll see how well that works. I think it should be good in discard synergy. I think it should be good in spell damage. It's going to be a lot of fun. Shatterglass Mage is now a 4-cost. So they said that Shatterglass Mage is the type of aggressively slanted, interactive, dynamic, mid-range card that's generally healthy to have around in larger doses. I think I'm mostly in agreement with this. I think this card is very good at 5 and should be extremely good at 4. It being somewhat pushed is not a huge deal because the card has 3 health, so it's actually fairly vulnerable to a wide variety of things. The main thing that it does is it really sort of does bad things to enemy attachments, which is always a nice thing to have access to in Praxis, and really nice to have access to at that particular card slot level. I think 4-drops are kind of one of the things where you're going to be suffering a little bit in Praxis. It's just like a hard area to put a drop into, and this also just means that you get to warp the card significantly more often, which warp cards should generally be reduced in cost so that you can warp them more often, and like this is something where you just get to play the card a lot, get some cool value out of it, and then it's still like a really nasty overwhelm card that has some push to it. So huge improvement to the card. It's overall like a really well balanced card. I think at 4 it's not going to be sick or overpowered, but it is going to make people wanting to carry relics a little bit less of a thing, especially when you're playing against Praxis, which may end up being much more of a thing with Heart of the Vault coming back down. Alright, what else? We got Tattoo Dragon. It's going from a 4-3 to a 4-4. Not a huge fan of this change. I think the card, like, is already kind of okay, and I seem to recall it promoted some really weird sacrifice effect bonuses where there was just like a lot of extra cards being played, and all of that was sort of being used to fuel like an infinite Stone Scar engine that was just like not a lot of fun to play against. This card being less vulnerable does make it more powerful. I don't know that it ever had a pattern that I really loved. The 2-2 Oni Grunt is a pretty boring unit. It typically ends up being sacrificed, and like overall I think that like extra health for this card is not something that I was particularly looking for. I think it's fine. It's definitely a good change up, and a 4-4 for 4 with flying is really good, especially when the card also has Pledge. Jawbone Greatsword now has Overwhelm. I can't remember if it ever had Overwhelm before and then lost it, but it is a card that, you know, is quite strong with Overwhelm. This is going to allow you to attack people on a lot of different axes. The card can kill big units, do a little bit of extra damage, and then create a big unit for later for value. So it's got both reach and value, and it's a really, really efficient relic weapon. This card's super fun. Having Overwhelm just makes it more fun. It is potentially going to be a little bit busted, but I mean, at 4 for a 5-2, it's just kind of okay. I think it should be fine by and large. Sealed Writ now transmutes at 6, which I think is a pretty significant and fun change. I always liked Sealed Writ, but it was always too expensive. It deals 8 damage when you have no other cards in hand, and it's kind of a fun thing to do. I think I've definitely played around with a couple of different versions of a Sealed Writ deck. We'll have to see if we can find them and boot them back up. This is not going to be an incredibly powerful option for a lot of different decks, but it does potentially mean that a Sealed Writ deck is now possible at a competitive level, which is kind of fun. So yeah, would be really, really cool to see a cool Sealed Writ deck. Let me know what you think in the comments. All right, finally, Jotun Burst Song, went from 6 to 5. Good change. This card was always a little bit too expensive for what it was doing. It is a big value engine for Yeti, but it was just like, really pretty mediocre, because oftentimes the Yeti would have some sort of ability that you already wanted, and transmuting it into a blank 6/6 Jotun, which doesn't have any sort of tribal synergy, while also drawing more Yeti for tribal synergy, it's all just things that you're not super happy to do, particularly at that incredibly high influence cost and that incredibly high cost. Taking the cost down a little bit means that you get the card to be a little bit more aggressive, which is good, and all of the other stuff that it's doing, just making more Yetis and making mid-range possible, that's not a popular Yeti strategy, so that is something that can definitely be pushed and not see a huge change in the meta as a result of it. I think Jotun Burst Song has definitely got some potential now and could push some interesting mid-range Yeti decks, which I'm always a fan of seeing, like really weird versions of common archetypes. Mid-range Yetis definitely sounds like a really fun one, so I'm very much in favor of that one. So yeah, a lot of significant changes here. Heart of the Vault coming back in, a couple of the big staples getting nerfed, including one that has just been in like every time market forever. I think that's a huge deal. Dinosaur Nest getting taken back down a little bit, which is just a minor change, but something that I think has been probably wanted since Dinosaur Nest was released. And like pushing Nightfall cards this late in the game is interesting. We'll see how good those cards end up being. I hope that the draft environment is still a lot of fun. I'm particularly worried about Baying Sarasaur, but I'm excited for all of these changes, and it's a nice round set of changes this time around. We got good improvements for Throne, good improvements for Expedition, good improvements for Draft. Looks like it's just going to be a little bit more of fun of a game as a result, and by and large, nothing that I'm particularly opposed to or that I think will promote extremely unpleasant metas. It just seems like it's a lot of like good cleanup that's actually going to make some of these cards a lot more fun and interactive to play with. So yeah, very excited about this. Seems like it's going to be a fun time. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time with more Eternal patch breakdowns. I think we still might owe folks a breakdown of the Dinosaur set, so we might do that next. But yeah, gonna be a lot of fun. See you next time. If you want to check us out on Twitch, we're currently playing irregularly. due to a constantly shifting living situation where like stuff is bad. But I'm trying to put in more streams at later times, typically around like 11 to 10 p.m. PST, and we'll be back on our normal times of around like 7 or 8. Sorry, 7 or 8 MST shortly. So hopefully that'll all work out. All right. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time, and cheers as always. Bye.